So hopefully I got some of you still awake after the pretzels and everything. Like I said, my name's Chris Wigman. I'm a senior web engineer for 10up. I'm also the builder of the Better WP security plugin, which is now iTheme Security. So I've been in this space. I'm actually an ex-professional pilot. My first day as a pilot was 9/11. So I've been in the security space in one fashion or another for quite a few years, with a focus primarily on best practices and the human aspects rather than traditional what developers think of security, which is cryptography and hacking and stuff like that. I'd rather focus on some of what people are doing with it instead. So this talk will cover a lot of things that people are doing with their code and different ways to look at some of the code that we're using and how to use them. You know, we can talk about things like nonces and stuff like that that you guys hear all the time, sanitization all the time. I'm going to talk a little bit some more about some of the nuances with some of what we're doing every day that have led to some of the, in some cases, have led to some pretty big vulnerabilities just in the last few weeks. If you'd like to follow along or whatever, the slides are already online, cfw.bz/loop2015. So there's a good number of slides. If you'd like to follow along, please do so. So let's talk a little bit as we get started about this. One thing we have to keep in mind is a little bit about the technology that we're building WordPress on, which is PHP. The original inventor of PHP is quite clear of the fact that he never intended to write a programming language. He was just trying to make things easier for himself. As a result, PHP, rather than being like some languages and frameworks which are secure by design, that is, security was a ground zero, was one of the base considerations with their talk. In PHP, that wasn't really the case. PHP, instead, a lot of its goal was to make things easier. So it's designed to help the interpreter do as much as possible before your script ever runs. So it's, it gives a very low barrier of entry, makes things a lot easier, which is a lot of why many of us got started in WordPress in the first place. And it's going to do things like retrieve information, XML, SSL, all this information that comes in. It's trying to retrieve that before your script ever gets it. And it tries to set certain things up for you, like the super globals, request, get, post, without any respect to what's in those variables. How many times have we seen the classic exploits, echo, post, whatever? That has a lot to do with the foundations of PHP itself and its initial intention of ease over security. Another thing we need to talk about in any discussion with programming security, in particular with the web or PHP or WordPress or anything else you touch, is some of the standards and some of the problems that exist out there. The Open Web Application Security Project's been around a number of years now, and every 3 years it comes out with its top 10 problems in web applications. It was last updated every 3 years, and this is things like XSS attacks. These are things like security misconfigurations. All the normal things that you hear anytime that there's a vulnerability, chances are it's in their list. This is the 10 most popular things, and it changes. Frankly, it doesn't change all that much, typically every 3 years, but usually a couple drop on, a couple pop off. So everything that you're protecting against, everything we're working for, you would find in the OWASP top 10. So let's talk then a little bit about some of the vulnerabilities that cause these problems, these XSS, and we can talk a little bit about the classic PHP vulnerabilities, such as register globals. This was something that everybody used really up until way too long. Register globals, what it does is actually anything in those get variables, those post variables that aren't touched, it sets them as a regular variable. So in my example here, if get authenticated is already set to authenticated and you don't check it, and that's how you're checking for somebody if they want to use your application or not, all you have to do is put authenticated equals 1 into your URL, and it goes around it. That's register globals. It would, in this case, in this little example here, it would allow somebody to just completely bypass anything you're doing if the data's not already there. Of course, in most cases, these things are turned off. Hopefully you have this turned off, but this is one of the classic problems along with magic quotes. A lot of people don't realize what magic quotes actually was. Magic quotes was an attempt by PHP to make things easy. Its idea was, let's sanitize everything for you, in theory, before it even hits your script. And this was a very common method. Frankly, in some ways, it might be considered a good thing. A lot of people historically at one point did consider this a good thing until people stopped using it. Once you stop using it, what's going to happen? Well, you relied on it, so then you take out the sanitization you would do manually. So really what it leads to with what the problem was with magic quotes was lazy code. So instead of using your proper sanitization and everything, we relied on PHP to do it for you. Again, this goes back to PHP's initial mission. Let's make it easy versus let's make it secure first. Now, the plus with these two things is they're not really as relevant anymore in most cases. Both of these were, of course, deprecated in PHP 5.3 and removed in PHP 5.4. However, because we still have to, in many cases, develop for PHP 5.2, maybe not for long, and if you have any kind of plugin of any size or theme of any size, anything that's public, you're still developing for PHP 5.2. These are still something to look out for. Another thing that you have to watch out for is if you've developed with things like magic quotes in the past, and hopefully not too many in this people in this room just because of the nature of how we all progress in our careers. I'm guessing most of the people in this room have been here a while. But if you're developing with things like magic quotes, it really does add a little bit of a disadvantage to you as you're getting involved with things like security. So that's just something else that you have to consider as you move forward. So those are some of the classic PHP vulnerabilities. Once we get past that, then let's look at some of the PHP functions themselves that tend to cause people problems. Many of us have seen something like this appear in a theme. In the bottom of your WP config file, or the bottom of your whatever theme file, this was actually taken from a hacked site. And what I want to demonstrate here is actually two pieces of information in this. The first one being the base64 encode and base64 decode. Another very valid PHP function. You see things similar like this even in CSS when people are encoding images so it can be passed with the CSS. Very similar type of techniques that we use if we want to pass any kind of binary data as text. In WordPress, we tend to see it a lot in cases of people trying to obscure their code. Hey, it's GPL, but I don't want anybody to know what I'm doing, so if I wrap it around, somehow people will never figure out how to decode it. I do see that type of thing a lot. You'll see it in things almost always with different types of hacks. You'll see it in conjunction with one form of hashing or another where people are actually using it to hide a hacked code. So it's a type of thing that you need to use or you need to watch out for. One of the alternatives you can do with it is make sure that anything, binary, we're all trying to save HTTP requests. So you're watching out for things, and that's where a valid use of this. On WordPress, you'll flag almost any security scanner out there. And in most cases, it's simply something that can be avoided just by re-architecting your code just a little bit. And that's a pretty popular one that you see in hacks. And then, of course, the other one is the eval. This executes code in PHP. Anything you pass to it, and I've actually seen plugins that'll pass functions in things like JSON or whatever came in, get variables, post variables, straight to eval to be evaluated and run as PHP code. So anything PHP can do at that point, access your database, delete your database, add users, remove users, anything else like that can be done with eval. It executes remote code. Really, there's no reason to use it right anymore. If you're using something like this in your plugin, you're probably doing it wrong. There's very little reason for this to appear, especially in the WordPress space, when there's alternatives available now. APIs, SaaS services, all sorts of things that can execute whatever you need to do remotely and then send it back to you, avoiding the types of problems that would be caused by using the eval function. Another place you'll see this, and this is another eval type thing, is I've actually seen people do this. Now, if you were to actually write this and expect it, or the way people typically mess this up is they forget about where the slashes need to go in the preg replace. This is a regex function with a /e at the end. And what it does is it actually tells regex to evaluate whatever it pulls out. So it's another example of running eval accidentally. A lot of people don't realize that when you're evaluating regex, you can even do this. You can tell it whatever it pulls out, whatever you're matching in your regex expression to actually evaluate the code for you, which can, of course, be fairly dangerous. And because it's something as simple as adding a /e to your regex, which sometimes is the result of people just mistyping where the slashes go, it can cause some problems on that type of thing. There are alternatives, and in fact, this has been deprecated in PHP 5.5, but again, so many of us are developing for older languages, that things like preg replace callback, where you actually assign a callback to process the data, just like you would in JavaScript or other things, any type of callback you would use. While they're available now, it's still something that we need to watch out for in some of the older code that we're writing. Another popular one is create function. You see this done a lot in some of the more advanced plugins. I've seen this. Usually not the most advanced developers, frankly, and thankfully, but you do see a lot of custom plugins that are trying to create a function based on some sort of dynamic variable. We pass whatever it is back to PHP, and we're trying to create a function that we want to execute with it. So before anonymous functions like what JavaScript uses, this was a good way of achieving the same result. Call a function as a variable, but it also uses eval. So again, it's another very valid piece of technology that we all know. I think most people in this room have probably heard that the idea that eval is evil. Well, here's another way you can actually access eval without ever typing eval, just using the create function that you still see. And in PHP 5.3 or greater, you can actually use a true anonymous function, very similar with, of course, different syntax to what you would use in something like JavaScript and some of the other things. So there's new ways to get around that very easily. This one's common, especially in plugins or themes. Include a variable .php file. Pass it whatever name, execute the file, and of course, anytime you run an include, it's going to execute that code within your PHP. These slides are awfully slow. That's kind of interesting because it wasn't supposed to. Why use it? Link to other PHP files. This is a very common thing. If you have more than one PHP file in your code or theme, you need a way to load those files. So we want to include things. But if you're generating those names dynamically, you can lead to another remote execution. So what it really comes down to is another aspect when you need to hard code file names. And if you need to access something remotely, you need to access something dynamically, this is another good alternative where you want to start looking at things like the JSON APIs and other data services, other data connectors to connect to that information remotely and use it as such. Now, this also applies to require once, include once, and functions like that. Another commonly misused item with WordPress. I see this a lot for people who aren't familiar as well with the WordPress API. It's file get contents, pretty basic. You're trying to pull in data from a remote site via a very common PHP call, file get contents. There's a problem with that, though. It doesn't actually check to see if the SSL, if you use it for an SSL site, is valid. It doesn't care. If it's a self-signed certificate, or if somebody's hijacked that site and is using something else in between, it's allowing that type of function to be subject to a man-in-the-middle attack. It's not just this function. This actually applies to pretty much anything in PHP that you're using streams or sockets for. So this is one of those items where you really want to make sure that you understand the WordPress API pretty well, because you could use curl, but WordPress API gives you two very good functions to replace this with. It's WP Remote Post or WP Remote Get, which by default will actually verify SSL and things like that. So if you ever want to pull anything back from an SSL site, which more and more of the web is going to, understanding and using what WordPress has for you is going to be a very, very advantageous thing. Of course, you can actually disable that in curl. You can set these. You see this a lot with people developing test sites. Your test server has a self-signed certificate, so remote post, remote get, curl is going to fail. Okay, so let's disable the certificate checking. A very valid thing to do in test and dev, and then it gets left there when the thing launches. We see this, I see this quite a bit. You see this again, and just about any types of services, when you're developing a service that is connected to these APIs, you're going to see it quite a bit. So we can turn off things like verify host, make sure that it's, which is going to tell it's the host for the certificate we want, or verify peer we can turn off. Why change them? Self-signed certificate, forced connection. Of course, the better way is just to fix the SSL certificate for $9 or next year, hopefully free, or maybe that's this year when they're supposed to be coming out with the free SSL certificates. There's ways around this very easily. You can also do the same thing here with WP Remote Get and WP Remote Post. And this is where I see most people get in trouble with those two functions, is they both take an array of arguments, args, with the SSL Verify option. By default, it's on true. But of course, if you're testing things, it's very easy to set it to false and wind up getting yourself in trouble simply because, oh, well, I needed to test this against my dev server. I didn't want to pay that $9 for a certificate, and then you just leave it in there. So there's something that you have to watch out with, even with valid methods that you use. Filter var, another common one. By default, PHP tries to validate a URL. The problem is PHP doesn't care what protocol the URL has, whether it's HTTP, HTTPS, JavaScript, or something else. In the case of my example here, I'll jump back for a second. JavaScript, whatever it is, alert 1. That is a valid URL, according to PHP. So it's an example of watching what's going on. You need to be aware that just because you think that your URL should be HTTP or HTTPS, executing that valid URL with that JavaScript there won't actually do anything. Now you've just exposed yourself to an XSS attack or a similar type of attack where things are going to run for you that you may not want to have. Or another common one, and there's actually some really large plugins that use this directly. I won't say which one I got this code from, but it's out there, is unserialize. Well, nowadays we're moving into JSON REST API. That'll be in core at some point. It's something a lot of us are familiar with. I'm sure there's a talk somewhere on the schedule for it today or tomorrow. It's a new but very common way to get data. Historically, we've used serialized data. They're a valid way to transfer data. It works, but it's got one problem. It executes the code that it receives. So if there's a constructor, if there's a wake-up function in the PHP it receives, it'll actually execute that code as it tries to instantiate the object that it receives. Once again, you've just exposed yourself to running code on your server that you didn't know. As opposed to JSON, which whether it's an object or an array or whatever you're receiving, it won't actually run anything for you. It won't try to run a constructor. It won't run any kind of wake-up calls, leaving to much safer execution, much safer way to receive that data. Yeah, this unserialized one is actually still really common. I've actually had plugins of mine flagged, not because I use it, but because I allowed for other plugins that did. So it's still a very big thing, even in .org today. Sometimes it's considered a security vulnerability just by itself, but because it is a valid way of doing it, it's typically, I haven't seen the plugins being removed for it yet. So the better thing to do now is just use JSON. It's a mature enough technology. Of course, then there's WordPress functions to watch for as well. And I'm going to talk about the two big ones that have happened just in the last few weeks. The first one being isadmin. A common misconception of isadmin thinks, well, are you an administrator? It's not, are you an administrator? It's is the page part of WP admin for all practical purposes. So admin post, which anybody can go to, would execute an isadmin call. There are a number of, again, very large plugins, very large services connected to WordPress that were using just that for basically validation. Instead of using it that way, you always want to double check. The way to get around this is use current user can. So if you want to see that the person's actually an administrator, current user can manage options. Current user can insert post, whatever it might be there. So it's another type of thing where a very valid function, without the understanding of what it's from, can get you into trouble very quickly. Add query arg. We just saw this one recently. It was 2-3 weeks ago. A number of plugins, a whole lot of plugins actually got in trouble and were flagged for the way they used add query arg. Again, another very valid thing. What this function does, if you haven't used it, is you can take a number of values and it'll append it to your URL and format everything for you. So if you had a get variable, you wanted to add foo equals bar to the end of your URL, you would add it here, and it would take care of adding the question mark or the and symbol or whatever it is that you need, and it'll do it for you. Catch is, it doesn't actually sanitize the URL itself. So that last parameter where you add the URL, especially if nothing's provided there, it'll use the server element to actually pull in whatever's under your server superglobal, and it'll spit that back out, and it'll attach your query args to it. Another item that can get you in trouble. That's exactly actually what happened there. It was a misunderstanding in the documents, and the documentation in the WordPress codex that led to all kinds of people using this that wasn't quite in a way that it was intended. They were assuming, it's been assumed that this was sanitizing data, and it wasn't. So again, sanitize everything being passed. And the bottom line is here, there's a lot, and I could go, I had a few people review these slides before, and they kept saying, add more, because I could talk about these for hours. There's all sorts of functions in PHP and WordPress that if you don't understand how they're used, if you don't understand why they're used, can lead you into just as much trouble as not sanitizing data or the other types of things you would do on a daily basis. So the big bottom line here is don't assume the function you're using is handling the security for you. And I missed that it was not Johnny Appleseed. I missed that when I switched themes, so that's my apology. But don't assume the function you're using is handling the security for you. It isn't. A function does one thing and one thing well, hopefully. Often what you want it to do is not security. If you're calling something to format text, if you're calling something to concatenate arrays or manipulate arrays, its mission is not to sanitize that array for you or to sanitize that data. Its mission is to do something else. So think beyond the immediate functionality of anything you're trying to use. And this gets us in trouble so often in WordPress. Of course, sanitize early, escape at input into DB or output on the page. No matter what it is, even if you assume that the functions that you're manipulating your data with are going to handle this for you, test it, watch that. Escape it anyway, sanitize it anyway. And of course, unit testing. We've heard about unit testing and things like that here already. Make sure that anything, things like filter URL. If you had a unit test running on that function and making sure and you're passing valid data, or you're passing the right kind of tests to it, that's the type of thing that you're going to discover very quickly is, oh, wait a second, that JavaScript that's being passed into that isn't valid. My test just failed. These are a very valid reason to make sure that you're using things like unit tests on a regular basis. It's one of those things that we often overlook, and one of those things that can get us into trouble very quickly. Finally, some resources to get you a little further. That was a very quick way of saying don't trust the documentation when it all comes down to. But there's a lot more documentation that can actually build on that and are very valid resources to take things like the codex a step further. The first one is the WP vulnerability database. It's basically a database of all the vulnerabilities found in different WordPress products, kind of an aggregate source. There's the RIP scanner, which you can get from SourceForge. It's a nice way of scanning your code and looking for a lot of these common misuses of functions, common misuses of various techniques that can get you in trouble. A lot of false positives, but especially on smaller code or a project where you're putting it together quickly, it can give you a lot of ideas of what to look at and focus on that maybe you just didn't realize it was being used that way and can cause you problems. There's the PHP security cheat sheet, which is on OWASP. Another excellent resources with different things to make to kind of remind you, hey, double check this, watch out for that. And finally, wpscan.org. I'm always a little hesitant to put up this last item. What wpscan.org is you give it a website, and it'll scan for vulnerabilities in that WordPress site. Please don't use it on somebody's site unless you have permission or it's your own site. It gives a lot of information. It can pull users from WordPress sites. It can tell you what plugins are vulnerable. It can go back on all sorts of different things just to see where you're at as a site as a whole. So it's a great way to determine if that site you're about to launch for a client is still using something that might have been overlooked, like you missed it in the vulnerability database or something like that. And that's what I have for you guys today. I know it's quick. I'll be happy to talk with anybody else after the conference if anybody else wants to talk on the topic. Thank you very much.